that, it was theology. They were also the leaders of school reforms, and after the Second World War, it became psychologists. And I would say today it is economists.
Actually, remember, nobody knows what psychology is, so be careful in terms of using that language. It may not be as clear as it sounds when you get actually into the nitty-gritty of it.
So, welcome to the Nordic Metamodern. My name is Lene Rachel Andersen. I wrote a book a few years back called The Nordic Secret, and in that I bring together two concepts: Bildung, which is a kind of pedagogy, together with developmental psychology. I did that together with my friend Thomas Björkman, who is the editor. And because we brought these two things together, a lot of people think that bildung-pedagogy is the same as developmental psychology, but I don't think they are, and that is what we're going to explore today. And so I've invited two guests, Gregg Henriques and Lene Tanggaard. And I would like the two of you to just briefly introduce yourselves to the audience. And Gregg, if you could say a little bit about where you are and who you are and what you do and why you're doing it.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here and sharing some thoughts and learning as well. So I am a professor of psychology in the Department of Grad Psych at James Madison University. I live in Virginia, about 2 hours south of Washington, D.C. My particular background is trained as a clinical psychologist, so trained to do psychotherapy, psychological assessment, and consultation. I'm also a theoretical psychologist. They don't just exist in theory. There are a few theoretical psychologists out there. Actually, my real kind of obsession is kind of defining or thinking about what psychology is or ought to have been conceived of as. And what that would mean if it were done coherently and tied all these different schools of thought together into a package that would generate cumulative knowledge. So that's kind of my fascination. And my work is to offer a framework that maybe ties them together better than we've tied them together before. That has lots of implications for how we see the human condition and how we might see education at this very important time in our world, to borrow from Zach Stein.
Right. And I see behind you, you have a sign there, welcome to the Garden of the U-Talk.
Right. So
in order to not confuse everybody who's watching, maybe you should just say a few words about that.
So right behind me. So I initially developed this thing called the Unified Theory of Psychology, and then it grew into a unified theory of knowledge that I represent by a garden. It was originally called the Garden of Atua. The general frame is called U-Talk, which stands for Unified Theory of Knowledge. So if you hear me mention U-Talk, I'm the founder of U-Talk, and it can be represented as a garden. There's all the symbolism back there, but basically, hey, we eat off the tree of knowledge and then find our way back to the tree of life, and we might be able to flourish if we get our knowledge better coherently organized.
Cool, thank you. And Lene, please.
Yes, I'm Lene Tanggaard, and I'm a psychologist as well, and a professor of psychology, a professor in educational psychology at Aalborg University, where I've been for many years, 21 years, I think, or 22 years. And since January 2020, I have also been rector at Design School Kolding. So I'm now stretching myself across 2 disciplines, or maybe 3, education, psychology, and now also design. And the reason that I am now at a design school, I think, has to do with my research interest in creativity. And I have also been writing about design. And I'm looking very much forward to this conversation, which I think is extremely important. And yes, that must be it. Today I'm in Copenhagen, but I live in Aarhus, which is the 2nd largest city in Denmark.
So you actually spread over 4 different cities in Denmark.
I am, and I'm in Copenhagen because I also have my own radio program called In the Workshop, where we do interviews about creativity with famous and not so famous Danish persons, composers in particular. It's a music program. So that's why I'm here right now.
And one other reason is that you are one of the prominent voices in Denmark with regards to bildung and education. So whenever bildung and education comes up, there's usually, or at least very often, Lene Tanggaard in the conversation. Cool. So I'm just going to introduce the whole topic here also for people who may not be familiar with developmental psychology and bildung. And bildung is a German word, as some of you know. One way that I describe bildung now is that it's two different kinds of knowledge. It's the relatively easily transferable kind of knowledge. So what we usually have in education, math, science, how to bake a bread, book a train ticket online or something like that. And we can test if people have learned it. We can test if they can reproduce it, if they understand it. There's a different kind of, and so we can call that the horizontal kind of knowledge, and you can always expand your horizon in all kinds of directions. The other one is the vertical kind of knowledge, which comes from life experience and which is almost impossible to transfer from person to person. It's also impossible to, so it's about our emotions, our moral development, emotional development. And if I have an experience of, saying, falling in love and being heartbroken, if I try to explain it to somebody who has not experienced this, they have no clue what I'm talking about. I cannot teach it to them unless they fall in love with me and I break their heart. But if they know what I'm talking about, there's a resonance in the other person. And so the combination of this vertical life experience, emotional depth, and perhaps moral aspirations or moral goals, or whatever you can call it, or what kind of person you want to be, combined with the horizontal knowledge is one way of describing bildung. And in the Nordic Secret, among other philosophers, we're bildung philosophers, I write about Friedrich Schiller, who says that there are three kinds of people. There's the emotional person, there's the rational person, and there's the free person. And it's a developmental process where you start out, and he describes adults. So he says that there are adults who are totally caught in their own emotions and therefore they're not free, but they can transcend these emotions by making the norms of society their own. And so they internalize the norms of society. And so they're the rational people. They live by the rationale of society. And thereby they're not free because they live according to the expectations of everybody else. But they can transcend this and become the free person if they reconnect with their emotions. So they always have this double choice, so to speak, between their emotions and the expectations of the surroundings, and thereby they're free because they can choose between them. And this is the result is bildung, and the process is bildung. And then there is, so this is 250 years old philosophy, and that's called bildung, and it's tied to pedagogy and to the transfer of knowledge and to life experience. And then there's the modern developmental psychology, and the person, or the psychologist, I don't think he actually is a psychologist, Robert Kegan, that I refer to a lot in the Nordic Secret. He writes about adult developmental psychology, and then there was Piaget, who wrote about children's emotional and moral development. He stops around the age of 15 and is very much based on how our brain evolves as we grow and how we interact with other people, but it's very closely tied to our physical development as children. And then, of course, as adults, the brain has more or less, it's fully grown when we're 25, but we can still develop. And everybody knows that they would rather, if they have a really big problem, ask the grandmother for advice than somebody who's 42, for instance. So we all know that we do evolve as we get older, but Kegan has defined some phases for this, and there are other models as well. And Kegan talks about 5 phases. So there's early childhood, that's covered by Piaget, late childhood until the age of 12, it's also covered by Piaget. And then he talks about the self-governing person, which is the teenage years, where we play by or learn to play by the norms of society. And this can continue in adult age. But there is also the other possibility that you can evolve or develop beyond that and become self-authoring, and author your own life, but also become the authority in your own life. And then beyond that, there's a sort of a senior stage where he calls it self-transforming. It's rather hard to explain, but I guess it's because you have been through so many changes through life and you're still there. You can still remember what it was like to be you when you were a child or when you were younger. So you don't disappear, but you have transformed so many times that you don't get sort of overwhelmed by a lot of changes. And the interesting thing, and that's where the connection between Bildung and developmental psychology comes in, is that what Friedrich Schiller says about the emotional person matches what Keegan describes as late childhood. The rational person matches self-governing, and the free person matches the self-authoring. And they're using different words and they're describing it in different ways, but it's obvious that they notice, or that they're describing the same thing. So my question to you, and perhaps to Lene first, because you're a professor both in pedagogy and in philosophy. Does this make sense? I mean, how close are these two things?
Yes, I do think it makes sense, and I think it is a very beautiful description that you have, and it made me think about Kierkegaard as well, the Danish philosopher, which I think has some comparable thoughts about this. And in psychology, it's very common to have these ideas of phases in the development process. And I think one of the tasks today is actually to combine children's development and youth development and adult development and late life development to a greater extent than we do today, integrating theories as Geo might talk about. The good question, I think, is which has also been a critique of some of these theories of phases, is if it actually is a more free floating process, so that you can be, for example, a very young person and be free. So do you have to go through all of these developments? Does the one phase have to be fulfilled before you can enter the next phase? And I don't think so. And of course, my perspective on this, because I am a professor in educational psychology, is that it matters what kind of childcare and school and education that you go through, so that you can actually create schools that enable the free person to sort of flourish. So teaching and how you teach matters in relation to these phases, and the way that we are together in school and in daycare matters. And if we teach too much to, you know, as in Denmark, there's been a big discussion about goal steering, and then we might disconnect or make it might be very difficult for our children to enter the free phase, the self-governing phase, because if we only teach them how to reach goals that others have set up, then how are they to develop free thinking, creative thinking, and so on? So yes, I can see the fit, and I can see how useful it is to combine thoughts from psychology and education. But of course, I think we're also going to talk about the problems within that. But certainly, I think it's a very nice description that you are making here. And I like the idea about the horizontal and the vertical aspects of knowledge and competence, because I think in Denmark, and maybe in the world as well, but we need to have that distinction more into the discussion. So that would be also my invitation to you, Lene, to actually make that point.
Thank you. How about you, Gregg? Because you have a long history in psychology, but Bildung is new to you, or relatively new.
Yeah, no, it is relatively new. I got introduced to it by you, and I hadn't heard of it before. I had certainly interacted with it conceptually in the sense of, say, I'm a father of 3 children, watching my kids go through school. They're learning a lot of skill development in general. Sometimes I'm wondering the relevance and the organization of that skill development, but what they're not learning is what you call the vertical. I often would complain that my kids went K through 12. I don't think they got an hour of education even on what an emotion is, yet alone how to relate to their emotions in a particular kind of way, and guidance in relationship to what I would have called character development and building. And that's that kind of, that Zach Stein refers to it as ensoulment and transcendence. It's sort of like, okay, what do we really value in the world at the level of sort of transcending our own personhood and ultimate value? And who are we? This is what I deal with in psychotherapy. Who are you in relationship to your injuries and your emotions and your defenses? And how do you grow into a flexible, adaptive, coherent, integrated individual that is true to yourself, and but also able to work well with others and be oriented towards potential flourishing? The school system is not doing any of that. So when I heard Bildung as an idea of, say, I think you put it really nicely, yeah, we need skill development vertical, the horizontal structure, but we somehow need to attend to help develop the children in a particular way, and then the adolescents, and then the adults, and then hopefully those adults will be on their way to continue their learning and development vertically as well as horizontally. I love that idea, and I see it definitely, really absent in our educational systems, at least here in the United States.
So one of the philosophers who wrote about Bildung about 200 years ago was Fichte, and he said that Bildung comes from pushbacks. He uses the German word Anstoß. So when you bump into something that makes you think that, oops, I was wrong about this, or, oh wow, is that the way it works? I think that actually Piaget has the concept as well, and he calls it schemata or something, that we have these sort of, yeah, we imagine that the world is in a certain way, and then when we need to revise that, it can either be a complete change of it or minor adjustments. But sometimes there are so many minor adjustments that you really have to, change your worldview. So that is the psychology as well. One of the things about pedagogy and psychology is that I mean, as you both say, good pedagogy education has both aspects. How much of that is in the general teacher's education or pedagogy education? Maybe Lene, I don't know if Gregg knows about that, but Lene, how much focus is there on this, on the psychology side of things?
In Denmark, there is right now a revision going on in teacher education because during the last years, and I can't remember when was the latest reform, but psychology and pedagogy got removed from teachers' education, and instead it was these disciplines were developed into sort of split up and fragmented into something called teachers' development and the pupils' development, and so now we have these subjects coming back, which I think is a good idea because they are substantial, as I see it, in teacher education, because you need to know both a lot about children's development and youth development, and what it means for education, and how education might inform also our ideas about development. And I think we have a different stance in Denmark, because Bildung is something that we talk about and we consider it as central to our school tradition. But we have also missed some of the language connected to it. So we have become insecure because of the global competition related to schools and education. But right now, I think the task is to in a sense go forward by going back and remembering where we came from, and and again, to emphasize, I think it's so simple and so it's easy to understand. You know, we have the horizontal aspect. There's something you have to learn in school, of course, but going to school for many years is also about the vertical dimensions, the self-development, self-governing, becoming a free person who can actually think themselves and think critically about their own life and about the development of society. And I think Dewey's idea, as you mentioned, it has been inspirational for myself, because, as he says, to enable this, we have to have teaching that allows us to be in a situation of inquiry where we are not certain about what's going on, where we discover things that surprises us and begin to think, and maybe also creating new kinds of understanding, and teaching can do that. And that's an important message, that schools actually have a task in relation to bildung. It is not only an inside sort of psychological phenomenon. It's in the world, and we can create conditions for it to happen.
So one thing that I have discovered, and this has really been a learning and bildung process for me as well, is that one of the fundamental differences between pedagogy / teaching on the one hand side and psychology on the other one is that if we're in a teaching situation or a pedagogical situation, we have the shared third. And now I'll just bring in a cup to illustrate. So, I mean, if we're all going to learn about this cup and I'm the teacher and you're the students, we have the shared third, and we're sort of on equal terms with regards to this. I may know what's in it, you may not, so I may have more knowledge than you do, but we're learning together, and so we're also creating a relationship around that. But if we're in a psychological situation, so to speak, in a therapeutical situation or in a coaching situation, if I were the therapist and Gregg was the client, for instance, Gregg would be the object for both of us, and there would be a difference, a power balance in the relationships. That's one of the differences between pedagogy and psychology. I don't know, Gregg, if you.
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple things there. So the first thing I want to say is I attend to the word psychology quite a bit. So for me, the word psychology is properly construed as a science that's similar to biology in its nature. And then we apply psychology in particular ways. And one of the ways that we apply it is in the context of mental health. And we then develop specific kinds of therapeutic applications, for example, psychotherapeutic application. So the psychotherapeutic system and setting is totally different than the educational setting. And it needs to be, they should learn from one another, but absolutely what you say is correct. In the context of psychotherapeutic attention, which by the way, isn't, in my estimation, that's not psychology per se. So that's the knowledge of human psychology now informs what it is that I would do as an applied practitioner in a particular context. One of the things that I argue about psychotherapy is actually we have generated a common core of knowledge that we could extract and create much more generalizable knowledge for. And that if we did that, we could hand it over to pedagogy, I think, in a way that would afford insight into the vertical. I don't think we've done that. Instead, I think it's been a fractured, sliced up empirical, here mid-level theories with evidence that you hand, and then it looks like it's scientific, but when you generalize from this little research program, try to implement that into the real world and then do that times 100, you don't get the sum of those parts do not cohere. You often get the lesser than the sum of the parts. So I am not happy with what psychology has been structured to offer at the science side, and then how it can offer pedagogy, the kinds of principles that would inform this generalized vertical development. I think we have a lot of knowledge about that, but I don't think that that has been shared in a way that's useful for the pedagogical context. And so I'm sad about that.
Lene? just nodding and agreeing. Cool. So that's a perfect segue too.
I can always talk more, but I just wanted to. I agree, because as I see it from my experience, psychology in the striving to become a science or be a science, we have also missed some of the more theoretical thinking, which combining all the small studies that we have been doing, and each of them are valuable, but we need higher level theories, I think, and that would also inform the discussion about what is psychology and what is pedagogy, education, and what kind of psychological thinking might be beneficial for education, and what might be useful to remove or discuss, at least while you're here.
So the other thing, or one of the other things that I would like to discuss with you, and that's really also why I brought us together, is that psychology has gotten a lot of power in education and in business leadership development, for instance. And Lene, you already mentioned what we have had, at least in Denmark, for the past, I think, 8 or 10 years, what is called goal-directed learning. So there are some goals, some learning goals, some, I guess, skills, behavioral skills. And I think that over the course of 10 years of primary school, it was like 3,500 goals that the teachers should get all the kids sort of pushed or pulled towards. And these, a lot of them are developmental psychology things. I guess there are some horizontal learning in there as well, but it's very much about social skills and emotional skills and inner development of various kinds. And one of the things that I've started wondering about is how come we suddenly have these goals in education, and it seems that politicians and policymakers and administrators have more or less stopped listening to the teachers and the pedagogues. I mean, the people who actually work with the children and who need to plan the education and who structure the education and who, you know, have 24 kids in a classroom. And I mean, I used to be a temp teacher for a while, and you're there with 24, 28 kids, how many you have there, and then you try to teach them math, and somebody's cat died, and they are not going to be able to listen to anything until you settle that thing with the dead cat, and then you can carry on. So there's all these things going into the teaching situation, the classroom. And I guess the same thing with adults, maybe some different issues, but you can sense that there's something in the room that you have to deal with. So it's an art form, it's a professional skill, it's a lot of things to be an educator. And we had a workshop, and Gregg was there, and a bunch of other psychologists, and I vented some of my ideas about education and psychology, and it wasn't all received equally well. I may have sort of pushed the limit on my agenda a bit, but it made me think, why is it that pedagogy and psychology have where psychology is used very much in the business world and in new public management, but pedagogy not so much? And here's my hypothesis, which is that 120 years ago, at the turn of the previous century, psychology and pedagogy were two professions and two sciences that were trying to figure out, so what is psychology? How does the human mind work? Who are we? And what is pedagogy? How do we teach in the best way possible? And they were doing each their thing. And they were trying to find out, so what does this mean in the modern world, in an industrialized society, and we need democratic citizens and so forth. And then in parallel to that, we have the corporate business world, which invents the conveyor belt, and we have an industrialization, we need more productivity, they want to sell more stuff. And so they start asking, and this is still my hypothesis, how do we get people to be more productive, and how do we get them to buy more stuff? And somebody asked the question, who knows about the human psyche? The psychologists. And then part of psychology becomes the servant of the market, of the corporate business world, of industry. and develops measuring methods, a certain kind of understanding of the human mind, productivity, and how you can convince us to buy stuff, and a language that fits into the corporate business world and which also has all these measurements, so it fits into the spreadsheet once that has been developed. And then come the 1990s, when we get new public management, and then the psychologist, or at least the psychologist, have a language for what policymakers are looking for. And then we have psychology applied in places in society and in education and so forth, where it wasn't before. And what do you think of that hypothesis? I mean, as a citizen and somebody who looks at education, what happened? Lene.
I think parts of your story is true, and there are some small nuances that matters as well. I do think psychology is a child of modernism. So psychology fitted as a discipline to sort of the requirements in modernism, industrialization, for example, mass schooling, and so on. So, and in relation to schooling, it was also really the IQ test. At least in Denmark, we began educating psychologists from Copenhagen University in 1944. It was also maybe in connection with the war, but the main reason was that there was a need of psychologists to go out into schools and find the children who suffered or had potential. And the IQ test developed in France was a good tool. So yes, the measurement is true, but it is actually also a progressive story about how some of the tools actually sort of was part of making a more equal society, you could say. And then came sort of the change. I'm not going to give the same story as you did, but of course it also somehow fitted with so the need to develop a new perspective on life. I think after the Second World War, at least in Denmark, psychology was influenced in relation to the reforms in schools from that period and on. Before that, it was theology. They were also the leaders of school reforms, and after the Second World War, it became psychologists. And I would say today it is economists. So psychology as a discipline is not that influential anymore in relation to government. But what has happened is that we all think of ourselves as a psychological being, and that's the main influence, I think. So people believe that problems are psychological problems. Parents, children, everybody around it. So if there is a problem in school, then we look into the psychological language to try to explain it. And it's very good, but sometimes we miss that we are in an educational context. You know, we have a cup, and that's sort of the task. It's not a psychological institution. The school should not be that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly generally agree with the outline that you offered and what was added to it. I mean, I think I am deeply concerned with psychology in its relationship to modernity, both intellectually and in terms of industry and governance and all of this. So intellectually, it's like, okay, how does psychology, what is it and how does it fit in relationship to the emergence of natural science? That's my big intellectual question that I've struggled with. And then it's well, how does it fit with industry? So what psychology is trying to do is it's trying to jam itself into the epistemology of modernity, meaning how we know. So it's trying to create psychometrics. So psychometrics is, okay, well, how do we measure stuff and develop statistical analysis of things? Psychologists are very influential, and the IQ test is absolutely central in that. So now you're getting measurement devices, and you get the development of some low-level but unbelievably powerful technologies from the behavioral school. I mean, Skinner basically is like, you know, whatever he's talking about is like, what I'm after is the prediction and control of behavior. He's actually very much a humanist. I mean, people paint him in a particular sort of way, but he's humanistically concerned with developing engineering structures so that we can predict and control the evolution of behavior. And well, you know, if you're interested in prediction and control, business people are interested in prediction and control, and government. So you can pull off a lot of that stuff, and at a low level, I mean, a very sort of foundational level, how it generalizes, and then what you do with that, and then what's other stuff going on is tricky. But the psychometrics and behavioral stuff, and then there's the language issue that Lene brought in, and I totally agree. If there's a dominating force in the world that psychology takes over, it replaces a lot of theological language, and now we're psychological beings, and everybody utilizes that. And of course, my concern is, actually, remember, nobody knows what psychology is, so be careful in terms of using that language. It may not be as clear as it sounds when you get actually into the nitty gritty of it. But it is; those are some key evolutionary elements in terms of cultural evolutionary notions that I see psychology playing a big role in transforming. It'd be interesting to know, I think the economic considerations, certainly in the United States, are massive here. So I think, you know, what's really the disciplines that are pulling the ultimate strings? I'm not sure psychology is there, so maybe the economists.
So I'm actually an economist, but I.
Yeah, you can see that.
All right, so there you go. Back to you. Take it from there.
But if you have, as a teacher, whether it's one-on-one or it's a classroom or it's a full auditorium, whatever, and you have a goal that is connected to some kind of emotional development, and how do you actually do that? I mean, can you put that kind of demand on a teacher and say, we would like all third graders to be able to before they, you know, get to the fourth grade, or all the, you know, 18-year-olds should be able to have this kind of empathy or something like that? I mean, can you do that?
I can maybe start, and then Greg, because I would say in Denmark we have a purpose. It's skolens formålsparagraf. So we actually have a school law with a purpose, and the purpose says that a lot of things, but one of the things is that we have to strive for a school where the children get knowledge and skills, but also what we call alsidig udvikling, which might be personal development or development.
Broad development, yeah.
Broad development, and bildung is often connected to that phrase, because our purpose, our school law doesn't say anything about bildung, but it says something about alsidig udvikling, and also there's some values there. This is free spirit, åndsfrihed, and equalness and democracy, and you cannot break these values down into goals. So that would be insane. You say now you have to develop your free spirit of mind, and in this language session, third grade, now please do it. But you can have it as an ambition. It's something that you strive for. It's something that you maybe we will never realize it. Maybe it's too much in a sense. But what we can break down into goals would be some of the horizontal aspects that you were talking about. There's some certain aspects of each subject in school that actually can be goals, and where it makes sense to have it as a goal to learn how to do whatever it might be, some calculations, or to do your grammar, or whatever it might be. But the goal steering development in the Danish school, what it has, the main problem as I see it, is not so much the emotional thing, but it is more that we have become less ambitious in relation to our striving for the big picture. So because if the purpose cannot be break down into goals, then if everything is goal directed, then we miss the point, you could say.
Yeah, I really I really like that. I'll borrow from my friend John Vervaeke here, who sort of categorizes different kinds of knowing. He's a cognitive scientist, lists 4 different kinds of knowing. Propositional, so that's knowing about language-based facts. Procedural, which is knowing about how to apply recipes. Perspectival, which is knowing sort of how to see and pull out the landscape. And then the most abstract is participatory, which is knowing the identity relation between the individual and the environment in context. And so to me, what I often see is that people want procedural and propositional knowledge. Okay, sort of like I want the facts of this and then how to get from A to B on a recipe. And if we do that, then we can standardize, we can say what the goals are, we can measure that in a pretty concrete way. And you can generate kind of like, oh, standards of learning, that's the language over here. And then we can, but an enormous amount of living is not procedural, okay, or rote propositional. It's participatory. It's like I'm a living, free being. I enter into a particular novel situation. I pick up that the cat has died, and now the entire procedure is offline, right? And then the question fundamentally for human interaction is to be able to know when to apply the procedure, when not to, okay? And I see this in psychotherapy all the time. It's like, okay, we need empirically supported treatments, okay, that then apply manualized procedures. I had this fight in my discipline for a long time, and I kept saying, well, everybody you talk to that says, when you're suffering, you're like, yes, tell me what to do. But if I say, I'm going to treat you like a recipe and an algorithm, and I'm going to run you through steps A, B, and C so that you will be happy, and that's what we know scientifically to be true, you're immediately like, screw you. This is something wrong about this. You can't treat me like a robot. I'm just not some other person. I'm me. Well, then what they're basically speaking to is there's a participatory, unique identity dynamic here that needs to be felt. And if you overlook that and try to jam it into a procedural structure, the whole system is either going to turn into robots, which is not good, or it's going to rebel and become lifeless. So the entire structure adopts first principle epistemologies that are actually inappropriate to the context or is not up to the task. I always talk about, is the conceptual system up to the task of the ecological and value-based notions that we are actually bringing to bear? My critique against psychology is almost never, very rarely up to the task. And so that's disappointing if it's now getting a lot of power or has gotten a lot of power or whatever. So, you know, we need to cultivate participants that understand their identity in relation. And that's a very fluid thing. It's the ability to play jazz in a wide variety of different domains. You have to learn how to play the instruments, but it's a cultivating a capacity. And I think a lot of systems miss that. And I think that that's actually figuring out how to cultivate that would go a long way.
Actually, we have a Danish minister who has been writing about crafts, and he's himself a builder, and he says I can teach you how to build through a YouTube video, 10 minutes, you know, the basic skills that you actually need. But to become a builder in a collaborative team, that's a whole different story. You need years because it's rhythm, it's coordination, it's equal respect, it is understanding the customer, it is understanding what does it mean to have a deadline, you know. So that's the difference.
One of the goals for, say, empathy or something like that, and the bildung sort of intentions that are in the Danish legislation. Speaking as somebody with a little bit of teaching experience, my experience is that if we talk about something like empathy, for instance, I mean, it's not something that you can teach. I mean, you can tell people about the concept. We can have maybe a novel where somebody shows empathy and if it's well written, you can strengthen your emotional muscles, so to speak, and you can feel with the character. That's also empathy. But if you're a teacher and you have this goal-directed empathy skill, it's almost impossible to get there. But if you have the intention of, we need to, you know, develop the whole character, when we let them go and leave the school system, we want them to be as rich and deep and broad and high on the inside as they can be. And the moment when I can teach empathy is when I, for instance, have a conflict in the classroom, or I see somebody hitting somebody or taking something from somebody. And that's the situation where the emotions are there and where I can, interact with the kids. So this is where it's the jazz. It's the, so you just made your friend cry. That's when we take the empathy discussion, or I scold the child or whatever I do. And that is where you can have the training of the empathy, and you can use the situation, but you can't design the situation so that you bring out, oh, let's all focus on empathy at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, because that's when we scheduled dealing with this goal. So you can actually do a lot in education, but it's sort of around the shared third that it happens.
I love that. I mean, when I'm teaching psychotherapy, certainly there are some procedures and other kinds of things that can be genuinely useful. But fundamentally, what I'm after, what I call principles and processes. Okay, so it's a fundamental understanding of principles and processes. To give you an example then of what I mean by this, like a fundamental tripartite principle process is cultivate awareness, acceptance, and then active change. Okay, so all of a sudden, if their fight breaks out and I can gain control of if I'm going to try to move the system forward, I want to cultivate awareness of what happened. I want to get curious about what happened. I want to hold the capacity of the system to accept the negative situation, negative feeling relation, be present in relationship to that, but not freak out in relationship to it. Okay. And then think about valued states of being, and then cultivate action with feedback in relationship to whether or not we're actually able to then achieve the valued states of being. And so what you get there is you get, oh, yeah, here's a general process, principle-informed process orientation. And notice that's got a lot more participatory kind of flavor to it, rather than, oh, this is what you do when a fight breaks out. It's sort of like, well, these are the principles and processes that we want to cultivate. And to me, if you're going to try to start the process of shining a light on vertical development, which, by the way, I think in the States, we're way the hell behind on any of this. So I'm just sort of like, can we even say what sadness is? It's like, can we talk about what, and I live in a very conservative state. So, from a unified theory perspective, you want to learn that I'm a primate and I'm a person. Okay. Well, even to say I'm a primate is kind of controversial around here. So we got trouble in relationship to even basic educational structures. So, there's a lot of challenges that we face. But fundamentally, what I would say is that if psychology could get more into sharing principles and processes and guiding people around those, maybe we'd help pedagogy more in a more fruitful angle.
Yeah, I agree. I think our discussion centers around how the discipline of psychology on the one hand, and then sort of the appliance or sort of the practice out there, which is two different things, I think. And I think what might be needed is a more clever way of applying psychology in schools, because it can actually be beneficial, but not when it replaces sort of the educational language. That's where the trouble are, because then we miss sort of the purpose of education. And at least in Denmark, in recent years, there's been a bit of an aggressive, I think, tone around psychologists, and I understand that, because when you feel that you are rejected or misunderstood as a teacher, then who's the evil guys? And psychology is so popular, and we think in psychological terms, as I said earlier, and often replacing the educational language. But I think we should nuance it a bit, and then try to understand each other better, and then hopefully creating a better situation for schooling and for education, and also in a broad sense, education as lifelong education as well.
Yeah, I have to go ahead. Well, I was just going to mention this issue about what psychology is in the various domains is unbelievably important to me, because it leads us to much better understanding if we have our foundational first principles right, as far as I'm concerned. So there's a science side of psychology. When you're doing the science side, your task was developing good descriptive and explanatory systems in sort of as an objective way as possible at one level. But when you go into the classroom or you go into the therapy room, you're there to affect change by definition, okay? There's a great book called The Design Way. I heard you went to design school by Harold Nelson and Eric Stolderman. I'm not sure I caught that right. But anyway, The Design Way, it's actually, that's a play sort of off of a Taoist kind of the way. And what it delineates is an entire philosophy, essentially, of professionals, where professionals have to enter into an unpredictable world to try to achieve desired outcomes. And what is the philosophy of a professional? And what was cool, I had developed an argument that, okay, there's a science and then there's the profession of psychology, and it has all of these different elements that are fundamentally different, and we should know what they are, and these identities should be connected to things like computer scientists and architects and educators. And it's this side and that side, and the identity of this side that should be clear. I experience in my field, the psychology is so sort of like empirically driven. It's like science, science, science. And as if you could just translate science anywhere without values, can't do that. But we don't define what our values are scientifically. We don't analyze the ecology of systems because that's too complicated scientifically, yet that's actually what we do. So anyway, we need a philosophy of design. That's actually what's laid out in there. It's very different than science. And when you see it that way, it's a totally different kind of game. Now, we can use science to make very informed decisions about design for sure. But it is something that I wish more people had a better understanding of.
I like that. Then we have design as a connecting sort of.
That's right. That's right.
One thing that I know about the Danish school system, Danish society, but also the US, and I guess the whole Western world, and perhaps even the globe as a whole, is that we have a crisis of a lot of young people suffering from anxiety and depression, and we talk a lot about mental health. And I know that in Denmark there's a lot of resources for calling in more psychologists, but we do not look at the design of their everyday life, the school, I mean the system that they're in. So I don't know if you have any comments to that. Bet you do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but I just think you're so right that of course there are children out there who are in suffering very much, and we should make sure that they have the right or get the right treatment, and it might also be therapy or whatever it might be, but we should also remember that we can use psychology to design more healthy communities where we understand what a good life is also as a child. And that's what's missing right now, that we have a dysfunctional system where it creates individual problems that we then try to fix individually, and then it won't work.
I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, it's not like there's an epidemic of individual neuroses or brain, chemical imbalances that are shooting across the sky. What's happening is an entire developmental trajectory that is creating sinkholes for vulnerable individuals. So if you get some trauma, you get some isolation, you have trait neuroticism. Now there's all sorts of opportunities for you to fall into traps of isolation, of rumination, of vulnerability, of access to negative feelings, but not really clarity about how to integrate and upregulate them in a healthy way. So then you end up stewing them in a particular sort of way. And then this idea that we either need pills or therapy at an individual level. At some level, okay, you need definitely some psychotherapy available, but this is a societal and systemic thing. It's an indication that the processes of life history development from birth to young adulthood is seriously problematic. There are lots of reasons as to why we can generate good hypotheses as to why it's problematic. We should have no question that it is problematic given the magnitude of depression, anxiety, suicidality, and other kinds of, kind of mental health dysfunctions. We should see depression and anxiety as symptoms every bit as much as disorders, if not more so, meaning that they're symptoms of sadness, symptoms of behavioral shutdown, symptoms of failure to thrive in development, and wonder, well, what is that? And believe me, it's not just a bunch of individuals that are all of a sudden simultaneously having problems. There's an inability to mutually connect in our shared flourishing. And that's a social system problem that we need developmental social system perspectives around.
I mean, I suppose that a lot of young people are under a lot of pressure that is radically different from the pressure that previous generations were under. I mean, there's an individualization, there's a narrative, or at least has been a narrative for the past 40 years, that you can become whatever you want to be, your heart's desires. And that also puts a lot of pressure on you, because if you're not happy, then you made the wrong choice, or you did not, put in enough effort. And the whole structure of community, the village that it takes to raise a child, I mean, we more or less deconstructed all of that. And our minds were not, I mean, you're a primate, so am I, and so is Lene, and everybody, we're all primates. So we need that intimacy, the tribe, the close relationships, and the rituals, and knowing where we belong. And we more or less taken that away from a whole generation of young people.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think a lot about, I use the primate thing. I think a lot about sort of, what's the context of my body, my heart, my head, and my spirit. I use that loosely, but basically, what's my transpersonal morality? How do I think and justify what I'm doing? What's my felt sense of connection? What's my embodiment in the world? Okay. And that stack. And that stack is different when you're born, than when you're 2, than when you're 6, than when you're 12. But it's prepared for certain kinds of environments. What it's not prepared for at 12 is to manage TikTok and manage this idea that you can project yourself out into a world and get likes and slice aspects of you and alter your image, but have no real dialogue inside of a group that's also managed by elders, that's negotiated in nature. And we don't do that. That's what we're structured for. We don't do any of that anymore. We sit in our bubbles and live in a digital world and wonder why the entire shift of the way we relate to ourselves, relate to others, relate to nature is completely altered. And it's getting more and more altered more quickly. So one real hypothesis is we're out of alignment, and we have to think seriously. And to your point, Lene, the justification systems, okay, that we're supposed to be sort of socialized into is a dialectic of self with the legitimizing authority of elders, to use Zach's signs, kind of what's wise. Now we live in such a chaotic, fragmented pluralism. It's sort of like we deconstruct everything. Well, what's wise is whatever's wise to you. Well, at 12 on TikTok, that probably isn't enough to kind of generate the kind of identity formation that's going to be useful. Instead, what it does is just creates these ruminative cycles. And then, oh, by the way, now you have depression, so let me give you a pill. Oh my God, it's like, we're not doing our children justice here in relationship to the structure of socialization that would be much more conducive to, vertical development toward flourishing. We ain't doing that.
Yeah. And Bildung is actually a term that can inspire us to go to understand how important it is to have a sort of dialectics between the older generation and the growing generation, you could say, and we miss that today. So we're not responsible, and we are disconnected to nature, both nature out there, but also our own nature, I think.
Because one aspect of Bildung is, yes, the transfer of social norms and cultural heritage and sense of place, and sense, not just physical place in the out there, but also place in the family and in the sort of chain of generations. And just, upbringing. And the interesting thing about the word upbringing, we have it in Danish opdragelse, but we also have it in German Erziehung. It's really literally lifting people up. And we're supposed to do that with children. And one of the downsides of the postmodern world is this: we've really been afraid of lifting anybody anywhere, or just claiming that there could be something that is up and something that is where you could, that is lower, and we need to lift people up. I would like to also turn to a principle that we've had in the Danish school system, at least for a while. I don't know if we still have it, but which is responsibility for your own learning. Do we still have that? Or did we figure out it was a bad idea?
We have figured out it was a bad idea. I think it's it was 20 years ago. Somebody, and it was actually within vocational education in particular that this term became popular. And of course, it's half truth, you know. Yes, it is very, very good to take responsibility, but it must be a sort of a common responsibility within education because of what we've been talking about now, that we have bildung and balance is a kind of a dialectic between what is there and what is coming. So you cannot yourself take responsibility for learning. It is a common responsibility. And we have to understand that again, because otherwise children and youth will be feeling lonely, I think. Because
I mean, if you just ask the 7-year-olds in the first grade or 10-year-olds to, you know, figure out what is the right thing for them, I think one of the side effects was that all the kids who had academic parents got the help at home to figure out what they wanted to learn, whereas the kids did not come from a home with bookshelves all over the place, and parents who could help them were just lost in that system. So the final topic that I would like to bring into our discussion here is that, so I brought the old concept of Bildung together with developmental psychology in these different phases. And some of the people that I have encountered after doing this is people who are not coming out of psychology, but who are, many of them coming out of the corporate business world, and they're introduced to this developmental psychology. And there are a couple of sort of more popular models than others. Keegan is one of them with 5 different phases. Then there's something called spiral dynamics, which has, I think, 8 different phases, and the first tier and the second tier, and there are different colors for the phases that you are in, and they're kind of linked to societal development. And there's like the red kind of person, the red kind of society, which is sort of a traditional top-down masculine patriarchy kind of society. And then there's the second tier, I think yellow, which is the more open-minded, perhaps even resembling Keegan's self-transforming kind of person. And I am beginning to encounter people who seem to read this and then try to figure out, where am I? And it seems that a lot of people really want to be self-authoring or perhaps even yellow. And then they introduce themselves to me as, so I'm green tier 1, and I'm really happy about this level right now. Hello, my name is so-and-so. And so I'm wondering, are these phases actually a good idea?
Well, let me put it this way. You would not want a system where people rated their own intelligence, right? Okay. That would probably not be a very valid indicator. So these things are, I talk a lot about what's called the double hermeneutic in psychology, which is sort of when we deal with human sciences and you build a model that you then give to people. People are concept using beings, and then that changes them and it changes the model. So you get this weird iterative feedback loop that doesn't always, go so well. So I'm not a huge fan. I mean, there's certainly validity at a broad level to layers of development. You can get pretty specific in certain kind of models of hierarchical complexity around particular skill development. There's no doubt what a grandmaster of chess player relative to me looks like. There's no doubt about their capacity of metabolizing the chessboard in a way that's fundamentally more sophisticated. There are these levels across a number of different lines of existence to get self categories that then define you as a green tier 2 or whatever in relationship. Those kinds of justification systems are, I think, generally dangerous, ineffectual. They don't mesh well. And then those are, in terms of the ecology of the world, they're not really up to the task in that regard. They certainly have some heuristic value, but when you try to mesh them with the way people actually work, those things are not, I think, particularly valuable.
I agree totally. But it's quite interesting that, because I recognize the way of speaking about yourself. You know, if you've had one of these tests and you encounter people and they say, I'm blue. What is
I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, wait.
Yeah. But in a way, it can be seen as a creative sort of achievement. You know, people try to understand themselves and they make all these categorizations, and they are not really valid, because we also, our ways of life are much more situated than we think. So yes, I may be blue sitting in front of the test, but in other circumstances with other people, I might show different sides of myself. So there are much more dynamics in personal development than these tests make us believe. So the only way they can be useful is if they are a starting point for a good conversation about what might come, instead of fixating yourself in a particular image that might hinder your development.
I mean, one of the for me, it raises a number of questions, because I do find some of the models really useful as an analytical tool, which is what psychology predominantly is. It's a way of understanding what goes on inside people and between and among people, whereas pedagogy is so I have this person or these people around me, and it's my task to teach them something, and I need to get the best out of it, and hopefully I can help them with their emotional, you know, dealing with this and with themselves and the social situation, everything. So pedagogy has the anthropology, it has the psychology, it has the sociology, and has then the content as well. What I'm thinking is that if you make this one of these models, which is really a sort of a matrix of behaviors or things that are sort of grouped together, if you constantly measure other people and or yourself up against this system or this way of describing things, can you actually have honest interaction with other people? Or does it become a filter between you and the world? Because when people, you know, think of other people as yellow or green or orange or whatever, I mean, to some extent I do use Keegan's model like in the same way. I also use Friedrich Schiller. I mean, it's a very useful tool for navigating among other people, and particularly if you're in a collaboration situation and you can tell why some people cannot collaborate or why you can't get your relationships to function. I mean, it's absolutely useful, but it can also be this filter between me and other people where I may end up never really having an honest and spontaneous relationship.
Wasn't it Kurt Lewin who said that there's nothing as practical as a good theory?
It was indeed.
I think it depends. Of course, these models, ideas, theoretical ideas are valuable. It depends how you use them. So, and I think every tool can be used against itself. And we can't control that. We can't control people's ideas. At least I don't believe that. But we can. But I think it is very important to be careful when you teach people about these theories, that you have to raise the critique. You have to. I remember. Howard Gardner, because I've been writing about Howard Gardner in Denmark and his whole theories, and of course there's a lot of critique of them, and the multiple intelligence ideas can be critiqued for various reasons, but they have become very popular in education, and there's a book called Howard Gardner on the Fire, which is sort of a festskrift for him, his colleagues, writing about his work. And in the book, Howard Gardner tells about his experience when a colleague from Australia phoned him, called him, and told him about the way that his theories are applied in Australia, and how the body, clever people, you know, in a sense, the colleague said it's comparable to when we talked about Aboriginals in a certain sense. And Howard Gardner explains how he got very frustrated because that was not how my theory was supposed to be used. No, it's a psychological theory, and it should be critiqued on its own terms. It's not an educational theory, but you have to make sure how you communicate your theories, because that's the responsibility of us as psychologists, or philosophers, or sociologists, or anthropologists, and so on. But we cannot control how people use our theories. But we should be. The more simple you make the statement, the bigger the risk is that it can be misused, I think.
Right. Yeah, no, this relates much to the up to the task and all of this. You know, this unified theory of knowledge tries to get at the core of what's called human mental behavior. That's what we're engaged in right now. And it drops them to simple concepts at one level, but they're actually deep, broad concepts that hopefully are up to the task to connect very deeply to the actual ways in which people are, meaning that the sort of pejorative term that we psychologists sometimes use is folk psychology, okay, which is basically how the hell do people live before us, which is just fine, by the way. Anyway, but what the unified theory says actually, well, we're animal investors, meaning we invest our behavior for work effort. Okay, so you have desires and you try to do stuff. That's the doing, working towards the world. That's investing in certain kinds of outcomes. We influence each other. Okay, so you're an investor, I'm an investor, and then as I act, you act, and then do we influence each other? What are the ways in which we influence each other? And then the thing that makes us pretty unique animals is we also justify. We organize our propositional networks into various systems, and then those systems build and they feed back on us and they regulate and coordinate. So if you track us and you say, hey, we're investing, influencing, and justifying, that what it's trying to do is get at the simple core that's actually up to the task of us behaving in all the remarkably different cultural, historical times that we've been bathed in. But then these terms that have meta-theoretical grounding also then have this ecological reality of, yeah, we've been investing, influencing other, and justifying in this conversation. I'll do it throughout the day. And I encourage us to think about, well, actually, we'll all be doing a little bit of investing, influencing, and justifying throughout the day. And then it's like making those real in the participatory context of our lives. At least that's kind of the goal here. That's sort of, at least that I'm trying to advertise in this kind of psychology that I'm doing.
Well, I've gotten some cool answers to all my questions. I don't know if you have a couple of final remarks before we conclude.
I'm very happy you invited us. It's been a great conversation with you. So I loved it.
Yeah, and actually there's this concept called metamodernity. I don't know if you've heard of this. But if we want to try to create a particular understanding, I think we can pull from the indigenous traditions of our embodiment and relational world and nature. I think we could build systems of justification, speak to civilization. I think we can use logic and reason off of modernity. And I think we can critique those power systems of justification all simultaneously at once. There's a great book out there that says maybe how we can do this. It creates a particular kind of cultural context for Bildung flourishing. I'm trying to get my head around it, but you know, I'll just invite that as a possibility, kind of a framing solution, ultimately, in many ways, to this conversation.
I wonder who could have written a book like that. So, well, thank you both very much. I really enjoyed it too, and it's always a pleasure talking to you. So I'm very happy that we could do it, the three of us together. So thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great. Appreciate it.